I'm Spencer Bailey. This is Time Sensitive. Hey everyone, I'm excited to be back with season 7 and with a really moving conversation I had the other week with the Chicago-based artist Nick Cave. First though, before we get into it, I wanted to share a few quick updates. After an incredible 4 years of building the Slowdown and this podcast together and an unforgettable creative partnership, Andrew and I have decided to move in new directions. He's going to return full-time to his creative practice, and I'll be continuing forward at the Slowdown and here on Time Sensitive. I'll be forever grateful to Andrew for all that I've learned from working with him, and I'm excited to see all the great things he does next. The team and I have been hard at work the past few months building the Slowdown 2.0, which will be launching soon as a membership program with a slate of subscriber-only newsletters and original content. If you're not already a subscriber to our free weekly newsletter, you can go to slowdown.tv and click subscribe. Your support will continue to make all of our content and programs like Time Sensitive possible. I'll have more to tell you about what's next very soon. Lastly, I'm thrilled to share that the Slowdown will be hosting our first ever event and exhibition at Milan Design Week from April 17th to 21st. Called Take It or Leave It, the presentation will feature hundreds of items collected or designed over the decades by my good friend, the Italian designer and architect, Paola Navone. Rather than putting them on display, though, we'll be giving them away through a lottery for free. You can learn more about the project at slowdown.tv/Salone 2023. That's slowdown.tv/SALONE 2023. If you'll be in Milan that week, you can sign up for a lottery drawing there too. Okay, so on to the episode. This week, I talk with Nick Cave, an artist who, not to be confused with the Australian musician of the same name, is practically ubiquitous in museums around the world, most notably for his sound suits. He currently has an exhibition called Furthermore that's on view at the Guggenheim, and recently collaborated with Knoll Textiles on a line of upholsteries, draperies, and wall coverings. In Chicago, he and his life and work partner, Bob Faust, run Facility, a creative space in Irving Park. What really moves me about Nick's work is the joy that's imbued in it, a joy that's often rooted in deep grief and trauma. His famous series of 500-plus sound suits, for example, first began in response to the 1991 beating of Rodney King by the LAPD. A vibrant form of protection, the sound suits are his vital means of healing from and confronting the ongoing police violence in America. We get into all kinds of things on the episode, including his approaches to reusing and upcycling materials and the ways he seeks to find brightness and darkness through his work. It was an absolute joy to have Nick in the studio. I'd also like to thank our Season 7 presenting sponsor, L'École School of Jewelry Arts, which is supported by the Maison Van Cleef and Arpels. L'École has partnered with us on Time Sensitive for 3 seasons in a row now, and we're incredibly grateful for their ongoing support of the program. With permanent campuses in both Paris and Hong Kong, and opening this year a 3rd campus in Shanghai, as well as various traveling schools, L'École offers a wide range of classes, each lasting from 2 to 4 hours. With a maximum size of 12 students, these courses are taught by a group of 50-some teachers, art historians, gemologists, jewelers, and artisans, all of them experts in their fields. L'École's teachers bring a specific hands-on approach and a particularly high level of jewelry expertise that can't be found anywhere else. Art history lessons, for example, are based on unique historical pieces taken straight from the L'École collection. Introductory courses on jewelry making techniques are given by high-level practitioners. And gemology is taught by observing real stones and using professional gemology instruments. You can learn more about L'École and its many course offerings at www.l'ecolevancleefarpels.com. That's www.lecolevancleefarpels.com. And now, here's my conversation with Nick. Hi, Nick. Welcome to Time Sensitive.
Hey, hi. How are you?
I wanted to begin today with a question you've asked on several occasions, which is, what would it be like if we lived in a world where everyone for 1 hour a day sat in silence? And I love this idea, this hour of silence. And so I want to start there, hoping you might get a bit more into it. And what do you actually think would happen if the world abided by this daily practice of a silent, slowed down hour?
Well, when I think about this daily sort of practice, just that alone is like, oh my God, like everything to me just to sit in silence. I think you come closer to your truth. And I think that brings the clarity and the understanding to perhaps why you're here, or it's a lot just to be. I think it's important that you give yourself that time to reflect and to center and to get grounded. I think we live in a certainly a better world. For sure.
Also, on the subject of time, I find it striking that early in your career, maybe around 40 years ago, you wrote down this quote: "I'm working toward what I'm leaving behind." And it's interesting that you were thinking about legacy even back then. And to me, it's also a profound commentary on time, on production, and on the endurance of objects.
Yeah, and I think that quote was, thinking about the moment, yet projecting the future. And so living in these two sort of worlds, one that is real, that is now, that is today, and fantasizing about what it looks like or what it could be. How do I structure or design a pathway to sort of get to a place that I don't know, but have this desire to reach? And so it's this sort of guiding light or force that structures the agenda. I'm interested in an agenda, like what does that look like for each and every one of us? And how do we then start to sort of take full control of designing and shaping that and moving in this particular sort of path? Because we're all hoping to get somewhere.
This leads me to thinking about the sound suits. I mean, you've created around 500 examples over 30 plus years. The duration of that is incredible. The variety of textures, materials, shapes.
Madness.
What do you make of this duration? Like, why do you think they remain so interesting and potent and powerful even 30 years later?
I'm sort of thinking about the sounds in this sort of abundance as a collective, as a force to be reckoned with. So this is my aims to solidify a certain type of protest. It allows me to bring together others, hiding gender, race, and class, and forcing the viewer to look at something other without judgment. For me, it's, when I met the first sound suit, it was a awakening sort of moment because, as I'm building a sculpture in response to Rodney King, and in that process, it's all, constructed all out of twigs. And in that process, not realizing that I could wear this thing, and then I put that object on the body and started to move, and it made sound. was the beginning of me recognizing that this is a form of protest. This is to alert. This is an awakening of sorts. And this is something that is unfamiliar, scary, but yet seductive at the same time. And that weird space of like fear and seduction has always been an uncomfortable place for me as a agitator of sorts, but it's that alluring kind of element that I'm not sure what it is, but there's a humanness to it that I can identify with. And so just that, asking myself, am I open to something other? And how do I become available, accessible? How do I even surrender to that? You know, being in it is a whole different experience. You know, and for me, when I put the first sound suit on, it was, you know, the first thing that I did was I just stood there and looked in the mirror and just standing still. And in that space of standing still, you know, I also found myself standing upright in a way that I had never stood before. So just being empowered by this sort of gravity, the weight, the magnitude of this form. And, you know, pushing my shoulders back and standing with determination and curiosity was sort of empowering in a way that I had never, again, experienced. And so, you know, I'm thinking about, you know, it as a sculpture, but yet it's wearable. And I've always been interested in that double role, I think, and that comes from my experience at the Museum of Natural History. And I'm looking at all these artifacts through, you know, a glass case. And yet I'm reading about the significance of the roles in which they played within a particular culture. And yet I'm forced to sort of look at them as aesthetic sort of objects. You know, there's this sort of double message there, like, oh, so these really have a purpose, but yet they're art objects right now. And so that kind of shift of play that comes into the work is, I'm interested in the duality there.
I love that you said, when I first met the sound suit, because to me, hearing that, it sounds like you're meeting a living, breathing thing.
In that process, you know, I've given birth to this form, and it is here. It is like in front of me. So I'm sort of like, you know, and I don't really draw. So this is just me intuitively sort of making something and then putting it on the body and realizing that I am no longer who I was. And so then what am I right now? You know, it's interesting working with dancers and really sort of talking them through the process of transformation and becoming something other, and how do you surrender oneself in order to embrace something else. And that's bringing us back to that moment of sort of silence and being still and being open. And it's just part of how I sort of move through the world. You know, I have an agenda, but yet I'm very open to the improvisational moment through the day. anything could happen. And am I prepared for that? And being open is being prepared, because you will just sort of unfold the experience as it reveals itself. So, but I've always been like that for some reason.
The sound suits, of course, also reflect on police violence. You mentioned Rodney King, and this continues through to Michael Brown, Freddie Gray, Trayvon Martin, George Floyd, Tyree Nichols. How do you think about this ongoing violence across time, and how have these sound suits and your art making and community work more generally been a way for you to process, to mend, to heal and deal in the aftermath of this violence, which is also, I think it should be said, broadcast? I mean, going back to King, it was one of the first times there was a videotape of this.
Yeah. I'm fortunate to have this thing called art to work through it, because trauma's real, and it's psychologically debilitating, or could be. I've always had this place to vent, to work through it. You know, I think about facility, the building that I own in Chicago. And, you know, you buy property and it's an amazing studio lab for Bob Fowles, my partner, Jack Cave, my brother, and myself. You know, it's what we create, we invite. And it's also this amazing space where we can call and response in the moment. And so when George Floyd happened, I was in Missouri at my mother's, and she could tell that I was like on edge and like, you know, this kid needs to get back to Chicago because he is about to bust out of his clothes right now. And so I went back, and Bob had just come back from a rally with his daughter. And I said, he goes, you know, we just was part of this rally and it was amazing. And I was just sort of on edge. And I said, if you're going to march about it, you've got to talk about it. That's what I said. And then, you know, we started to talk about what I was dealing with emotionally. And then, you know, from his perspective and my perspective. But then at the same time, I was like, we have to sort of respond in the moment. And facility is a 24,000 square foot property, but the front of the building are these 3 storefronts that are exhibition spaces and project spaces. You know, we were able to respond in the moment, and that saved my life in that moment, because we didn't have to go through the bureaucracy of trying to work with an organization or an institution to sort of allocate a project. We were able to take a stance in the moment, and that has changed everything. So for me, being able to have space to call and response is, again, another sort of amazing sort of outlet. You know, we need outlets. We need places and to go to in order to work through this outrage and the emotional despair. It's heavy. And it's been heavy. I mean, as a person of color, you know, when I look back at my exhibition furthermore, when I first installed that exhibition at the MCA in Chicago, and I walked through it by myself, I realized that for almost 4 decades I have been trying to bring light to the subject of racism. I knew that prior, but when I saw this work over this period of 3.5 decades, it all became real clear. And so I really, really understood purpose, why I was here. And, I realized that I have been the voice for so many others. And the reflection of history and time. I mean, I think about as I'm walking through the exhibition, I'm looking at the first Twig suit. And yet I'm looking at the Trayvon Martin TM13 expression. And then I'm looking at Michael Brown. And then I'm looking at George Floyd. And these markers.
They're markers of time.
It's just unreal.
And it's really at the root. I mean, the oft-told story, you're sitting in a park shortly after the beating of Rodney King by LAPD officers, and you're looking at a discarded twig on the ground, and that leads to the first sound suit.
Yeah, and just feeling that, that twig was, the metaphor for what does it feel like to feel discarded, less than, devalued. But yet at the same time, I'm taking on that emotion that is very repressive and suppressive. And then I'm also sort of reimagining and shifting that narrative. And yet out of that comes this other being that's bigger than life, that's more than what we are enduring.
And you knew the power of that thing immediately. And I think it's remarkable that for so much of the 90s, you kept these sound suits to yourself.
Oh my God.
You've said I literally shoved all of them into the closet because I wasn't ready for the intensity of that attention. I mean, describe this incubation period to me, because a lot of artists, I think, would have just put it out there, ridden that wave immediately.
Well, I think for me, when it introduced itself to me, I knew in that moment, I knew that my life would never be the same. I could feel it. I didn't know what that meant, but I knew that I hadn't seen anything like it before. And so I wasn't quite ready for that because I needed, again, with one that's not sort of sketching out an idea, I'm sort of like having to accept what is just
there.
And so I am like, okay, I need a minute to think about this work. But I kept working. I kept making things, and that was the beginning of this sort of work that was rooted in sustainability and working with excess and surplus. Again, realizing in that moment that all my resources really lie outside of my studio. They're just out in the world, and they're out in the world for me to gather and to pull together. And so it was really me sort of riding that wave and just making and seeing what would emerge from doing. And it took a minute for me to sort of gather my thoughts. And let me tell you, the moment that I did reveal the work, everything shifted.
I mean, that makes me think of these 8 years or whatever it was as like an extended version of that 1 hour we were talking about earlier.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. And just to think, it's amazing to be making and not knowing why, but somehow there's a trust there that you must sort of follow, and a belief. And so Again, that's just years of just exercising this sort of space of silence and vulnerability, I think.
So last weekend, I visited Furthermore, which is now at the Guggenheim, curated by Naomi Beckwith. And I was so struck by how time and space collide in the most incredible way. It's organized across 3 floors, each its own section, what it was, what it is, and what it will be. Again, time, past, present, future. Philosophically, how do you think about time, and how do you think about that in the context of this exhibition?
Well, I think about what it was, what it is, and what it shall be. I mean, I just love just how those subtitles for Furthermore just kind of, there's a movement there. You feel that you're sort of like traveling in time, and each moment is a breath, a full kind of expression. And for me to think about the Guggenheim and to think about the architecture, number one, and this exhibition traveling upward as opposed to horizontally in a space was just sort of, again, very interesting for me to think about it that way, how one moves through the show, which is also time moving up, but also just the moment that you step out on one of the exhibition floors. I was just there, and all of a sudden, I went into one of the spaces, and my body, everything just sort of, I could feel that it was just shedding, and I was able to release everything and just be open to what I was about to experience. So something happens in the moment of entry for me at that show that I can drop all expectations and just be in the moment with each piece. In the moment in terms of history, in the moment in terms of where I am right now. It's hard sometimes, and yet it's comforting, and it's about trauma, it's about reality, and it's about forgiveness. We're struggling with a lot, and how do we somehow figure out ways to navigate in order to find balance?
Hey everyone, taking a quick break here to tell you a little bit about our Season 7 presenting sponsor, L'École School of Jewelry Arts, which is supported by the Maison Van Cleef and Arpels. L'École brings together teachers, jewelers, art historians, gemologists, designers, lacquer masters, enamelers, setters, lapidaries, mock-up makers, and others to share their passion and knowledge of jewelry with the world. Through courses, conferences, exhibitions, videos, and book publications, L'École makes the world of jewelry accessible to all. No matter one's experience level, L'École opens up an incredible art form that has long been reserved for a handful of people. Through a fresh, pioneering approach, L'École sits at the crossroads of art, gemology, and craftsmanship, and contributes to and consolidates knowledge around the fascinating, vast world of jewelry. You can learn more about L'École and its current and upcoming offerings at www.lecolevancleefarpels.com. That's www.lecolevancleefarpels.com. And now, back to the episode. There's also this role of memory, and there's a piece in the exhibition titled Time and Again It's an installation that's constructed from various workshop materials and tools similar to those of your carpenter and furniture maker grandfather, the ones he once used. And could you speak to that piece from a time perspective? I mean, time is in the title.
I can't remember the date when that was done, but that piece came about when I lost my first grandparent. And at that time, I also was headed to a residency for a year in Charlotte, North Carolina, the McCall Center residency. And for some reason, I decided not to take anything. I just grabbed my backpack and jumped on a plane. That is very unusual. I normally like sending shit in boxes in the mail, but I took nothing. And so out of that experience, I was able to make new work, new materials, just being open to, again, the process. But at the same time, thinking about family and family structure and the hierarchy within that and the empowerment of coming from an upbringing of incredible makers. And so that particular piece was me paying homage to, a grandfather, James Galbraith, who was this amazing carpenter. And for me as a kid, that was what the tool wall looked like. The order, the arrangement was fascinating to me. And all of these utilitarian sort of objects made something. And that was probably the most important thing, is that these tools allowed something to be created. It was really me sort of paying homage to him, and it also sort of shifted the practice. And so from that point forward, whenever I went to a residency, I just grabbed my backpack. And which allowed me to expand in terms of material language and stepping out of those comfort zones and ways of working that I was familiar with, and exploring and playing and failing and, just making shit.
So after walking through the 3 floors, I took the elevator down to the museum's basement theater, where I watched the 3 films on view. And I was particularly moved by Gestalt and Blot, both from 2012, and both of which are so much about time. In Gestalt, there's this feeling of being trapped, almost, that time's running out. There's this sort of urgency. And I was wondering if you could speak to that.
Well, with Gestalt, I was working in Chicago at one of these sort of open studios that we rented to shoot the video. That's when we walked into the space, there was already a set there. And I said, we're just going to work with the set here. Because it was there. And I was like, why not? When you're doing a video and you're working with a director and creating this sort of film, they have all these cards, which are these cards that sort of tell the narrative, the story. They were like, where are your cards? I'm like, I don't have cards. We're just going to improv, and we're just going to work in the moment, and we're just going to see what happens. And I sort of, that's always been my approach. And what I like about that for me, it's that it's real. It's all in that one take. And it's all me communicating with the performers that this is what I'm looking for. Think about sort of like being trapped in being sort of contained within a space and you have no way out. And I just wanted to capture those moments. And that sort of narrative, that story was just created in the moment. And then we just sort of did the first take. Same with Blot. But this is also sort of working with professionals that sort of understand their bodies and they understand how to take direction. And so with Blot, that was one take. One take. Blot for me is that space of meditation. The sound is unreal.
Well, I have to stop you here because watching Blot, which it is meditative, there's an almost hypnotic quality. And I actually, while watching it, found myself returning to a work of yours that was upstairs, Seasick, which is made up of several historic oil paintings, cast hands, a plastic ship, and at its centerpiece, this ceramic racist caricature. And the sounds of the sound suit in Blot create this pulsating lapping effect, almost like waves hitting the hull of a ship.
Yeah.
And maybe it's a reach to make this, but that's what I viscerally felt. I'm sitting there in the theater. I just got chills even telling you that. I mean, the way I responded to that film was in reaction to Seasick and the connection between the two.
You know, I think that's that sort of intuitive sort of space that, that I sort of work in. It's all sort of coming out of the same sort of idea of or subject matter, but yet, taking different form.
Yeah, this isn't didactic. Like my connection is kind of far reaching. Like most people might not make that.
But I can see by looking at Seasick and just sort of the rhythm of the waves as you're looking at the painting and just that sort of repetitive pattern that's there. So I get it. It makes sense to me. As you said it, I'm like right there with you. Like, I get it.
Let's go back to your upbringing. You were raised in Fulton, Missouri, the second eldest of 7 brothers, and you come from this family of many homespun traditions. You have a gardener grandmother, master quilt maker grandmother, carpenter and furniture maker grandfathers, one of whom we talked about, 6 seamstress aunts. I mean, incredible family of makers.
We're talking like amazing. Yeah.
And you've described your family's home life as an atmosphere of unconditional love. You've credited your mother with jumpstarting your career, for her just oozing enthusiasm about the art you made, like these little birthday cards.
Oh my God, that or a macrame halter or something, anything. But, just sort of like looking at her expression and I'm sort of thinking like, whoa, this little object that I made or this handmade card provokes this kind of emotion was like magical to me. It was like, whoa. So I have always been drawn to that moment, those moments.
How do you think about the memory of this time in your life, being surrounded by these people? And I also wanted to mention your paternal grandparents' farm in Carrington, Missouri, which seemed like a whole other kind of life.
Well, it's interesting, like farm life. This is the deal with farm life. We really couldn't touch anything. Like we couldn't work in the garden because it was like so pristine. And so we could look at it, but we couldn't really work. Does that make any sense? Like we just could look at things and we could be there and play but it was just sort of that was just this sort of world. I mean, and the hogs, and it was really quite lovely. And was I interested in getting dirty? Not really. But it was very, that was one set of grandparents that had the farm, Ernest and Rosamond, the Navins. And then the other side was, that's my father's side of the family. And then my mother's side were the bake sales at the county fair and, church and getting dressed up for church and just sort of this whole other sort of world. Love, it's interesting, like even now, like when we all get together, it's like everyone kisses and hugs everyone right at the front. And nobody brings drama. Nobody. You do not bring that into the house. So I never understood when, like, holidays, there was so much drama. I'm like, I've never really had that kind of experience. So, everybody checked that at the door. And so it was just interesting sort of knowing, like, the importance of family time and what that meant.
Sounds like, real love, not the commercialized, kind. And do you see your work as a manifestation in some ways of that love, of that feeling?
Oh, totally. I was with the staff at the Guggenheim today, and I'm telling you, it was remarkable talking with them, and I could just feel the love and the importance of that exhibition for them in this time, in this moment, and the importance of them sharing the show with the world. So I feel that, again, I'm speaking for them and yet sort of enlightening them as well as myself about the future. So
to go back to when you were 17, your father passed away from cancer that year. And I was hoping you might speak about that moment, how you responded to the grief and loss. And I think it's interesting that so much of your work is kind of animated by finding brightness in darkness, discovering joy through pain. Do you see that as part of that processing?
Definitely that. And, coming up in the late 70s, 80s, and really in the height of the AIDS crisis and losing, like,
I read 5 friends in a year.
I mean, God, like, it was unreal. Just the fear and trying to process that and trying to help where you could.
Well, I did want to bring up at 18, a year later, at 18, you had what you said was your first museum experience at the St. Louis Museum of Art, where you saw an Anselm Kiefer painting and started to cry. And Kiefer, obviously, he's exploring some very dark, painful themes in his work as well. And it sounds like you had this awe-inspiring experience standing in front of this. And so I was wondering if you could describe that particular moment and experience. And do you see that as connected to this kind of processing conversation?
Yeah, I mean, that moment was an outer body sort of experience for me. I didn't really know why I was crying at that moment, but I knew that I was emotionally affected by something in this work. It's interesting that you sort of brought that up, because at the museum today, talking with the staff, one of the staff members said, I can't tell you how many people have wept standing in front of the table with the heads and the eagle. I got so emotional in that moment. Because, in that piece is about how decisions are made on the backs of others and who sits at the table. And so, I get it. I know what that feels like. No one ever knows whether or not that's going to happen. But again, I think when you are creating work in the space of vulnerability, there's so much that is unsaid. There's so much that is unspoken. And, but it's very much present in the sort of building of a work.
Thank you for sharing that. Shifting gears a bit, we can't have a conversation about your work without talking about materials. And we've touched on it, but, particularly found materials. And so I wanted to ask you about that. We often live in a world where we think about things in terms of quote unquote resource scarcity, but your work is almost a manifesto of the opposite. Which is that it's an acknowledgement of the surplus and abundance of materials around us and the thrown away things. You've called them relics, which I love. And it's a renegotiation of value and the properties these materials have and carry. And so, you're practically, I view what you do almost as an act of rescue. It's like a rescue operation. And you're venerating these lost and discarded things. Tell me about how you go in search of these materials, your time spent at flea markets, thrift stores.
Yeah, it's really quite extraordinary. I think, I'm going to go back to when I was maybe 12, and imagine you've got 7 siblings and then there's just hand-me-downs. And I'm I'm not having it. Absolutely not. So that was the beginning of me sort of deconstructing, taking something apart and rebuilding it so that I felt that it was my own at that moment. So I think that was that beginning of me thinking about that. And I used to go thrifting with my mother all the time. So thrifting was important to me. I remember in undergrad, I was thrifting to a degree where it was more curating. I would buy whatever was fabulous, and then I would open my house to the entire student body on the campus and just sell all these amazing clothes, shoes, whatever. So I was just totally interested in textiles and quality and construction and thinking about, back then it wasn't like a salon, but, operating with that in mind. And literally you could just come into my house and just go into the closet. Everything was for sale. I was I'll buy something else to wear. And so, again, sort of, gathering something, resources, materials, but yet not holding on to anything and being able to let it all go. That's actually, when I think about this exhibition, I'm looking at all this work and yet in mid-April, it all comes down and it all goes to museums and private collectors. And so I will never say it again. These sort of moments that prepping one to be able to work and to release things into the world in that way. But, me and Bob will jump on a plane and fly to Washington State. We'll rent a cargo van, one-way ticket, and we'll just start shopping our way back to Chicago. And let me tell you, fabulous. It is so epic and so insane and just fascinating because, I'm gathering some sort of, there's resource material that I need, but I'm wide open for new ideas to emerge in that process. So right now, if I go thrifting, antiquing, I'm finding that I'm making work in the moment, which is very different than when I started out doing that.
Hearing you talk about just the nature of material and resource, it seems like such a modern perspective, especially right now in the climate crisis. And, people talk about sustainability and upcycling, but that's just what you do.
That's just what I do. I've always done it. In materials, I'm interested in, material as language, and finding the proper means to express the idea. It has allowed me to sort of like, not only is it found, but how do we construct a material? How do we make a material in the studio? So it's really, very driven by techniques and sort of couture processes and working with a team that understands how to build a cloth. And again, being very open and working in the improv kind of language where, I know what I'm looking for. I know what I need to deliver, but not sure how we're going to get there. And so that's that sort of beautiful kind of space to be in. But, that just comes from just exercising. The more and more that you do it, the more that you are comfortable and able to sort of work that way.
And you mentioned these trips with Bob, and I know at one point you rented a cargo bay, driving around the country in search of some of the most racially charged memorabilia you could find. And in much of your work, you're using objects known as like quote unquote black kitsch. Could you share some examples of these? I mean, I'm thinking of the one in Seasick.
Well, Seasick was the catalyst for that whole body of work. That I was in a flea market and there was this what looked like this object on this sort of top shelf, and of this bust of a black male head, and I pulled it down because it was interesting, and then it read spittoon, and I literally flipped out. And so that was the beginning of a body of work titled Made by Whites for Whites. And it was really me traveling the country looking for the most oppressive, racist objects that I could find, such as a piano stool where this black figure was holding up the seat. I mean, just outrageous. I never know what's going to sort of trigger and push me further down the road as I need to go. But those are those moments that set the bar, that sort of moves us forward. And the amazing thing is we were sort of seeking out these objects. We were also documenting where we found them, creating this trace of a map. And then Bob created a takeaway newspaper with image of the artifact's location. And so that was amazing that as you walked out of the exhibition, you could take one of these sort of newspapers with you. So again, just sort of thinking about education, ways to inform, ways exhibitions can continue outside of the gallery.
There's something liminal about your work, which is, while often figurative, also entirely abstract. And it engages the viewer in these multiple ways of being. And so I find it interesting that you've installed several notable public art commissions in liminal spaces, particularly airports and train stations. There's the mosaic in the subway station under One Times Square, your work at Chicago's O'Hare and at the Kansas City International Airport, and at the Garfield Green L Station in Chicago. There was also your 2013 performance in Grand Central Terminal's Vanderbilt Hall. These transitory or in-between spaces get me thinking about something I spoke about with the poet Claudia Rankine, who was on this podcast. And she writes about a lot in her brilliant book, Just Us, which is her in conversation with white men at airports. And it also leads me to thinking about Reginald Dwayne Betts, another poet and another former time-sensitive guest, who's written Race is Liminal in America. It is a both border and veil. With these references in mind and just thinking about your work in these liminal spaces, I wanted to ask, how do you think about this liminal nature of work? How do you think about the liminal period?
What I think about is ambassadors, and particularly to think about like Times Square and these works that are in these sort of airports and the accessibility to who's experiencing that, and how does the community become ambassadors for that work. I love the fact that, the work is outside of galleries, outside of institutions, and lives within the world, the public world, and that any and everyone has access to that, and that it's permanent. That gets us back to working toward what I'm leaving behind. When I saw the subway piece, I was like, whoa, this is full circle, this moment. What I wrote then is right now in this moment. And it will be here long after I am. So it was really sort of like fascinating to recognize that, and also to think about transition, to think about essence. I'm always interested in, when I'm doing public work, how do I sort of transfer the essence of my practice into those kind of spaces? That's the most important factor, is that transition.
You're making movement. You're surrounded by movement. You're also creating a movement.
Yeah. And, when I think about like Times Square and the subway, again, I'm thinking about, and particularly with the tunnel there, I'm thinking about, okay, this is this sort of transitional moment trying to get from point A to point B. And so I want that to be active. I want the sound system to have motion. I want them to be I want the audience to be sort of in motion with that work. And so, again, choreography comes into play.
Yeah, it's a still mosaic, but it's full of movement.
And the fact that it's mosaic, and just to be able to capture that sort of motion in such a hard medium and a shattered medium. And yet there's fluidity and volume and scale and color and radiance and all of that. So
to close, you've often said, I'm a messenger first, artist second. And at the end of the day, I was wondering, what do you think the message you're trying to convey is? And what do you hope listeners today come away thinking and feeling and take with them?
the message, that we're one world, that we all sort of live collectively in. So inclusion is everything. We must unite. We must collectively stand as one. It's about love and compassion and empathy and hope, desires, dreams, forgiveness, all of it. Humanity.
One species.
Yeah, one nation under one groove.
I'm glad we got a P-Funk reference in there. Nick, thank you so much. This is a pleasure.
Yeah, great, thank you.
Extra thanks to our Season 7 presenting sponsor, L'École School of Jewelry Arts, which is supported by the Maison Van Cleef and Arpels. A unique place for learning, L'École welcomes the general public to the world of jewelry through courses, conferences, exhibitions, videos, and book publications. You can find out more about L'École at www.lecolevancleefarpels.com. That's www.lecolevancleefarpels.com. And thank you for listening. You can find more episodes of Time Sensitive on our website, timesensitive.fm, or wherever you listen to podcasts. You can follow us on Instagram at slowdown.tv. And if you like our programs, please be sure to subscribe and leave comments. Our theme music was composed by Billy Martin. This episode was produced by Ramon Broza, Emily Jang, and Johnny Simon.